400 years, heaven went silent, and no one understood why.
While God remained silent, entire empires rose and crumbled to dust.
Alexander conquered the known world. Unknowingly, he paved the way.
One universal language, roads across 3 continents, everything aligned.
The silence was never abandonment. It was the calm before the storm.
400 years, no prophet, no vision, no voice from heaven. The last divine sound recorded came from Malachi, and after that, absolute silence. But while God seemed quiet, the world entered convulsion. Empires were born and crumbled, languages changed, roads cut across continents, and without realizing it, humanity was being prepared for something no one expected. The year is approximately 430 before Christ. Malachi has just delivered his last prophetic words. The people of Israel had returned from Babylonian exile nearly a century ago. The temple was rebuilt under Zerubbabel, though it was a pale shadow of Solomonic glory. The walls of Jerusalem were restored by Nehemiah after 52 days of intense work. Ezra had read the law publicly, and the people wept upon hearing words that generations in exile had almost forgotten. There was hope for renewal, for a new beginning, for complete restoration, but reality was harsh. There was no Davidic king on the throne. The royal line existed, but without power. There was no true independence. The Persians controlled everything, and Israel was merely a small province called Yehud, in an empire that stretched from the Indus River Valley to the sands of Egypt, approximately 2.5 million square kilometers under the dominion of Artaxerxes. And Judah was a tiny dot in that vastness, paying tributes, obeying orders, surviving. And then, without warning, the prophetic voice simply stopped. Malachi delivered his last words about the messenger who would come, about the Son of Righteousness that would rise with healing in its wings, about Elijah who would be sent before the great and terrible day. And after that, nothing. Generations were born, lived entire lives, and died without hearing, "Thus says the Lord." Priests continued offering daily sacrifices, the morning lamb and the evening lamb. Scribes copied scrolls meticulously, counting every letter to ensure accuracy. The people observed feasts, went up to Jerusalem 3 times a year as commanded. But the heavens remained silent. The silence was different from anything Israel had known. Since Moses, there had always been a voice. Joshua heard instructions. The judges received callings. Samuel was awakened at night. David consulted and received answers. Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal with fire from heaven. Isaiah saw the Lord in the temple. Jeremiah wept oracles of destruction. Ezekiel had visions in exile. Daniel interpreted dreams of pagan kings. There was always someone speaking in God's name. And now, for the first time in uninterrupted centuries, total silence. And while Israel waited in that silence, the world around began to crumble and rebuild itself in ways no one could foresee. Forces were in motion, empires were preparing to collide, and a series of apparently disconnected events would begin to create conditions that no human strategist planned. The Persian Empire, which had dominated the known world for more than 2 centuries, seemed absolutely unshakable. Cyrus the Great had founded this power by conquering Babylonians, Medes, and Lydians in impressive succession. His successors expanded even further. Cambyses annexed Egypt. Darius I organized the empire into 20 satrapies, created an efficient postal system, standardized weights and measures, built the royal road that connected Sardis to Susa along 2,700 kilometers. Messengers traveled that distance in just 7 days, changing horses at prepared stations. The empire controlled immense territories, from the Indus River in the east to Thrace in the west. from the Caspian Sea in the north to Upper Egypt in the south. They governed through local satraps who maintained order and collected tributes. They tolerated diverse religious practices as long as political loyalty was guaranteed. For Israel, the Persians had been relatively benevolent. Cyrus issued a decree allowing return from exile. Darius financed the temple's reconstruction when the work was interrupted. Artaxerxes authorized Nehemiah to restore Jerusalem's walls. Compared to the Babylonians, who destroyed the temple and deported the population, the Persians were almost generous. But empires don't last forever. And in the rocky mountains of Macedonia, north of classical Greece, a young man was being educated by a philosopher named Aristotle. This young man learned rhetoric, science, literature, strategy. He rode horses that no one else could tame. He dreamed of glories that would make Achilles seem modest. His name was Alexander, and he would change absolutely everything, 336 before Christ. Philip II of Macedonia, who had unified the Greek city-states under Macedonian hegemony, is assassinated during his daughter's wedding. The assassin was a bodyguard with personal resentments. Some suspected a broader conspiracy. Theories involved Alexander's mother, Olympias, a woman of fierce temperament who hated Philip for marrying another. But regardless of who planned it, the result was clear. The throne of Macedonia became vacant. Alexander assumed it at just 20 years of age. The first months were of brutal consolidation. Generals who questioned his authority were eliminated. Greek cities that tried to rebel were crushed. Thebes, one of the oldest and proudest cities of Greece, was completely destroyed. 6,000 dead, 30,000 sold as slaves, the city razed to its foundations. Only the house of the poet Pindar was spared, out of respect for culture. The message was clear. Defying Alexander meant annihilation. In 334 before Christ, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with approximately 32,000 infantry soldiers, 5,000 cavalry, and a fleet of 160 ships. Declared objective: to avenge the Persian invasion of Greece, which occurred 150 years earlier under Xerxes. Real objective: to conquer the world. The first battle came at the Granicus River in Asia Minor. Local Persian satraps gathered forces to stop the invader. Alexander personally led the cavalry, crossing the river under a rain of arrows. At one point, a Persian axe blow nearly split his helmet. A companion named Clytus cut off the attacker's arm before the fatal blow. Alexander survived. The Persians were massacred. Asia Minor was open. City after city surrendered or was taken. Sardis, the ancient Lydian capital, opened its gates. Ephesus was liberated. Miletus resisted and fell. Halicarnassus required a prolonged siege, but eventually succumbed. Alexander descended along the coast, eliminating Persian naval bases, neutralizing the enemy fleet by land. Brilliant strategy. He didn't need to defeat ships at sea if he controlled all the ports. Then came Issus in 333 before Christ. King Darius III himself brought the Persian imperial army to face Alexander. Estimated numbers vary enormously, from 50,000 to 500,000 in the most exaggerated accounts. Probably something between 100 and 200,000 men against Alexander's 40,000. The terrain was narrow, between mountains and sea, which neutralized the Persian numerical advantage. Alexander identified Darius in the center of the enemy line, led a cavalry charge directly against him. The Persian royal guard fought fiercely, but the pressure was unbearable. Darius turned his chariot and fled. The king of the world's largest empire fled from a 23-year-old. Darius's flight caused general collapse. The Persian army disintegrated. Darius's mother, wife, and daughters were captured. Alexander treated them with surprising respect, but the humiliation was complete. Darius offered peace, offered territories, offered his daughters hand in marriage. Alexander refused everything. He wanted it all. Marching south, Alexander found resistance in unexpected places. Tyre, the Phoenician island city, famous for trade and purple dye, refused surrender. They were protected by 800 meters of water between the island and the mainland, walls 45 meters high facing the sea, their own fleet, absolute self-confidence. Alexander didn't have an adequate navy for a naval attack, so he did something no one expected. He built a causeway, a bridge of earth and stone, wide enough for siege towers extending from the mainland to the island. The siege lasted 7 months. Tyre resisted with ferocity. They used divers to cut ship anchors. They poured burning sand on Macedonian soldiers. Catapults on both sides exchanged projectiles daily. But when the causeway was ready, when the siege towers reached the walls, when finally a breach was opened, Alexander's vengeance was terrible. 8,000 Tyrians killed in the final assault. 2,000 crucified along the coast as a warning. 30,000 sold as slaves. The city that had defied was crushed. Gaza, further south, made the same mistake. It resisted. The local commander, a eunuch named Battis, believed his walls on sandhills were impregnable. They were wrong. 2 months of siege. Alexander was wounded in the shoulder by a catapult projectile. When the city fell, Battis was tied to a chariot and dragged around the walls until he died. Deliberate echoes of Achilles dragging Hector's body. Alexander saw himself as heir to Homeric heroes. And then Egypt. The Persian satrap had no resources to resist. The local population, who never accepted Persian rule well, received Alexander as a liberator. Egyptian priests declared him son of Amun-Ra. The oracle of Siwa supposedly confirmed divine origin. Alexander began to consider himself more than mortal. In the Nile Delta, he founded a city that would bear his name forever, Alexandria. He personally planned the layout of the main streets, a city that would become one of the most important in ancient history. Center of commerce, knowledge, culture, legendary library, lighthouse among the 7 wonders. But Alexander didn't stay to see any of this grow. He had an empire to destroy. Back to the east, pursuing Darius through Mesopotamia. The two armies met again at Gaugamela, October 1st, 331 before Christ. This time Darius chose flat terrain, perfect for his war chariots with scythes on the wheels. He had even leveled parts of the battlefield to maximize effectiveness. He had elephants, cavalry from all provinces of the empire, archers, heavy infantry, overwhelming numerical superiority. Alexander attacked in oblique formation, concentrating force at one point while refusing battle at another. Persian chariots were neutralized by light troops who opened paths and attacked horses from behind. The Persian line curved, fragmented. Again, Alexander led a cavalry charge against Darius's position. Again, Darius fled before the battle was decided. And again, the king's flight caused generalized collapse. Gaugamela was the end of the Persian Empire. Babylon surrendered. Susa surrendered. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, was captured and then burned. Some say it was deliberate revenge for the destruction of Athens under Xerxes. Others say it was a drunken accident. Darius's palace turned to ashes. Darius fled to the eastern satrapies, trying to gather a new army. He failed. In 330 before Christ, he was assassinated by Bessus, one of his own satraps who wanted to assume power. Alexander found the body and provided a funeral worthy of a king. Then he pursued Bessus, captured, tortured, and executed him for regicide. Even dead, Darius deserved respect. Or Alexander needed that pretext to legitimize his own position as successor. The conquest continued. Bactria, Sogdiana, regions that today are Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Alexander reached the borders of India. He crossed the Indus River. He defeated King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes, facing war elephants for the first time on a large scale. He wanted to continue, cross the Ganges, conquer to the end of the world. But his soldiers, exhausted after 8 years of continuous marching, thousands of kilometers traveled, finally refused. They would go no further. Alexander returned. The return march through Gadrosia, present day, southern Pakistan and Iran, was disastrous. Merciless desert, extreme heat, lack of water. It's estimated that a quarter of the army died not in battle, but on that brutal crossing. Some historians interpret the choice of that route as Alexander's attempt to punish soldiers who dared to defy him. Others see only strategic error. Either way, thousands died. In Babylon, Alexander was planning new campaigns: Arabia, Carthage, perhaps a return to India by a different route. The plans were grandiose, but in June of 323 before Christ, after a prolonged banquet and heavy wine consumption, Alexander fell ill. High fever, progressive weakening. 11 days later, at just 32 years of age, he was dead. The man who conquered the known world didn't live long enough to rule it. He left no capable heir. When asked on his deathbed to whom he would leave the empire, he supposedly answered, "To the strongest." What happens when a conqueror dies without a clear successor? The empire shatters. Alexander's generals, called the Diadochi, meaning successors, turned against each other. Brutal wars for 4 decades. Alliances formed and betrayed. Royal families murdered. Alexander's mother, Olympias, executed. His wife, Roxana, and newborn son, eventually assassinated. No heir survived. When the dust finally settled, the empire was divided into 4 large portions. Cassander controlled Macedonia and Greece. Lysimachus got Thrace and parts of Asia Minor. Seleucus built the largest of the successor kingdoms, encompassing Babylon, Persia, Syria, and eastern territories. Ptolemy held Egypt with a firm hand, founding a dynasty that would last nearly 3 centuries. And Israel, that small strip of land between continents, ended up exactly in the middle, trapped between the Ptolemies to the south and the Seleucids to the north. Prize of dispute, potential battlefield, contested zone of influence. During the first approximately 120 years, the Ptolemies maintained control. For the Jews, the transition from Persian rule to Greek rule was relatively smooth. Taxes continued to be collected. Religious autonomy continued to be tolerated. The temple functioned, the sacrifices continued, but something more important than political borders was happening. Alexander didn't just conquer territories, he spread a culture, Hellenization. Wherever he went, he founded cities in the Greek style, gymnasiums for athletic exercises, where young men trained naked according to Hellenic custom, theaters for dramatic performances, temples for Greek gods, agoras, central squares for commerce and debate, libraries, academies, and more important than any building, a language. Koine Greek, a simplified and standardized version of Attic Greek, became the lingua franca of the entire Mediterranean world and the Near East. It didn't immediately replace local languages, but it overlaid as the language of commerce, administration, culture. A merchant in Alexandria could negotiate with a banker in Antioch, who could correspond with a philosopher in Athens, all using the same language. For the first time in human history, there existed a universal language connecting millions of people from completely different cultures. This language would allow a message, any message, to travel from city to city, from province to province, without the need for translation. The Jewish community in Alexandria grew enormously during the Ptolemaic period. Jews occupied entire neighborhoods of the city. They prospered in commerce, served in the Ptolemaic army, participated in civic life. But there was a growing problem. Generations born in Egypt raised speaking Greek, attending Greek schools, absorbing Greek culture, gradually lost fluency in Hebrew. The language of their ancestors became foreign, and the Torah was in Hebrew. This created a practical spiritual crisis, sacred scripture becoming inaccessible to a significant portion of the people. The solution was ambitious and unprecedented: translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. According to tradition preserved in the letter of Aristeas, a document from the 2nd century before Christ, King Ptolemy II Philadelphus wanted a copy of Jewish laws for the famous Library of Alexandria. The high priest Eleazar sent 72 elders from Jerusalem, 6 from each tribe. They were installed on the island of Pharos, where they worked for 72 days. The result was a translation that agreed perfectly, as if they had been guided by supernatural force. Modern historians are skeptical about the miraculous details, but not about the essential fact. The translation happened, called the Septuagint from the Latin for 70, an approximate reference to the number of translators. Initially, only the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. Then, gradually, other books were translated as well: prophets, writings, wisdom, literature. This translation fundamentally changed the accessibility of the scriptures. Suddenly, anyone literate in Greek, Jew or Gentile, could read about Abraham, Moses, David, could read Isaiah's prophecies, Jeremiah's lamentations, Daniel's visions. Jewish monotheism, its ethics, its history, its messianic hope, all available in the language the whole world understood. The Septuagint would be quoted extensively. In later texts, it would become the Bible of entire communities, and it was born during the prophetic silence in a city founded by a pagan conqueror under the patronage of a foreign king who probably had more political than spiritual interests. But the Ptolemaic peace over Israel wouldn't last forever. In 198 before Christ, the balance of power changed dramatically. Antiochus III, called the Great Seleucid King, defeated Egyptian forces at the Battle of Panium, near the sources of the Jordan River. Israel passed from Ptolemaic control to Seleucid control. Initially, the transition seemed favorable. Antiochus III issued decrees granting privileges to the Jews. He reduced taxes. He provided resources for the temple. He allowed them to live according to their own ancestral laws. It seemed like a good start. Antiochus III died in 187 before Christ, trying to plunder a temple in Persia to pay war debts to Rome. His son Seleucus IV ruled without major incidents, but in 175 before Christ, another son assumed the throne, Antiochus IV, and he adopted for himself a revealing epithet, Epiphanes, which means God manifest. The arrogance was declared from the beginning. Antiochus Epiphanes was determined to unify his fragmented kingdom through a common Hellenistic culture. Religious diversity was a political obstacle. Different practices created divided loyalties. And the Jews, with their absolute insistence on worshipping only one invisible God, with their dietary laws that prevented sharing meals with Gentiles, with their categorical refusal to participate in any pagan cult, were particularly problematic. The crisis intensified gradually. First, Antiochus intervened in high priesthood politics, selling the office to the highest bidder. Jason bought the position, promising accelerated Hellenization. He built a gymnasium in Jerusalem in plain sight of the temple. Young priests abandoned ritual duties to compete in athletic games. Then Menelaus offered more money and displaced Jason. Neither was from the legitimate line of Zadok. The high priesthood had become merchandise. In 169 before Christ, Antiochus invaded Egypt successfully. He was about to conquer Alexandria when a Roman ambassador, Gaius Popilius Laenas, confronted him. Rome demanded immediate withdrawal. He drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and said he expected an answer before the king stepped out of that circle. Antiochus, humiliated, retreated. He couldn't face Rome. He returned home, furious, and he took out his fury on Jerusalem. Rumors of his death during the Egyptian campaign had provoked riots in the city. Jason tried to retake the high priesthood by force. Antiochus interpreted it as rebellion. In 167 before Christ, Seleucid soldiers sacked the city. Thousands were killed, women and children enslaved, houses burned, and then came the decrees. Circumcision forbidden under penalty of death. Mothers who circumcised their sons were executed with the babies hung around their necks, then thrown from the walls. Sabbath observance forbidden. Families found resting on the seventh day were burned alive. In caves where they hid to pray, reading the Torah forbidden. Copies of the scriptures were torn, burned, destroyed. Anyone found possessing sacred scrolls was executed. Jews were forced to eat pork publicly as a test of loyalty. And the supreme outrage. On the 15th day of the month of Kislev, 167 before Christ, an altar to Olympian Zeus was erected on the altar of burnt offerings in the Jerusalem temple. 10 days later, on the 25th, pigs were sacrificed there. Blood of an unclean animal poured out in the holiest place in Israel. Ritual prostitution practiced. In the courtyards, the abomination of desolation that Daniel had prophesied centuries before materialized in stone and blood. The second book of Maccabees records stories of resistance and martyrdom that chill the blood. Eleazar, an elderly scribe of 90 years, was forced to open his mouth to receive pork. He refused. Friends offered to secretly substitute permitted meat so that he would only appear to obey. He refused that too. He said he preferred to die with dignity than to set a bad example for the young. He was tortured to death. 7 brothers were arrested along with their mother. One by one, in front of each other and their mother, they were scalped, had their tongues cut out, hands and feet amputated, were fried alive in giant pans. Each one refused to obey. The mother encouraged them all until the last, then died as well. Israel was being systematically crushed, and God remained silent. No prophet arose to explain the suffering. No voice promised imminent deliverance, only silence and death. But not everyone accepted destruction passively. In the small village of Modain in the hills of Judea, an elderly priest from the family of Joarib named Mattathias was confronted by a Seleucid official. A pagan altar was erected in the square. Mattathias was ordered to sacrifice first, as an example to the others. He refused. When a Jew stepped forward willing to obey, Mattathias exploded in zealous fury. He killed the apostate. He killed the official. He tore down the altar. And he fled to the mountains with his 5 sons, calling all who were still zealous for the covenant to follow him. Thus began the Maccabean revolt. The name comes from Judas, Mattathias' 3rd son, who received the nickname Maccabeus, possibly meaning hammer in Hebrew, or possibly an acronym of a biblical verse. When Mattathias died, just 1 year after starting the revolt, Judas assumed military leadership. What followed was one of the most improbable guerrilla wars in ancient history. Against all calculable odds, this group of peasants, armed with whatever they had faced, professional Seleucid armies. They used intimate knowledge of the mountainous terrain. They attacked from ambush in narrow passes where numerical superiority meant nothing. They disappeared into the hills before retaliation could be organized. They captured weapons from dead enemies. They recruited more zealots with each victory. Apollonius, governor of Samaria, marched to crush the rebellion. Judas killed him personally and took his sword, which he used for the rest of his life. Seron, commander of the Syrian army in Palestine, tried next. Defeated at Beth Horon, the same pass where Joshua, centuries before, had asked the sun to stand still. Antiochus sent Lysias, his regent, with 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Judas had perhaps 10,000 men. Even so, through tactics, terrain, and fanatic determination, he prevailed. In December of 164 before Christ, exactly 3 years after the desecration, Judas Maccabeus conquered Jerusalem. He found the temple in ruins. Weeds growing in the courtyards, doors burned, the altar profaned. But it was in Jewish hands again. Judas purified the sanctuary. He demolished the contaminated altar and built another with new stones that had never been touched by iron. He made new sacred utensils. And on the 25th day of Kislev, exactly 3 years after the abomination, he rededicated the sacrifices. The celebration lasted 8 days. The Jews lit lamps in the restored temple. According to later tradition, there was consecrated oil sufficient for only 1 day, but the lamps burned for 8 days until new oil could be prepared. This is the origin of Hanukkah, the festival of lights, celebrated to this day, victory of the few against the many, of the weak against the strong, of faith against brute force. But the war was far from over. Judas Maccabeus died in battle in 160 before Christ, facing superior Seleucid forces at Elasa. His brother Jonathan assumed leadership, then another brother, Simon. The family of Mattathias, known as the Hasmoneans after an ancestor's name, gradually transformed religious revolt into political dynasty. In 140 before Christ, Simon was recognized by popular assembly as high priest, military commander and civil leader, all 3 offices in one person. For the first time since the Babylonian exile, something like real independence. The Hasmonean dynasty would rule for approximately 80 years. They expanded territories through military conquests. John Hyrcanus annexed Samaria, destroying the rival temple on Mount Gerizim. He conquered Idumea to the south, forcing the population to convert to Judaism. Alexander Jannaeus came to control territory almost the size of David's kingdom. But the dynasty also drowned in internal contradictions. Kings who were simultaneously high priests, a combination that Jewish tradition kept separate. Civil wars between factions. Bloody conflicts between Pharisees and Sadducees. Execution of 800 Pharisees by Alexander Jannaeus, who dined while watching them being crucified. And while the Hasmoneans tore themselves apart internally, a new power was growing irresistibly in the West. Rome. Rome already dominated the entire Western Mediterranean. It had completely destroyed Carthage in 146 before Christ, salting the earth so nothing would grow. In the same year, it razed Corinth, demonstrating that resistance to Roman authority would be punished exemplarily. Roman legions were the most disciplined and efficient military force the ancient world had known. And now they were, looking east. In 63 before Christ, 2 Hasmonean brothers were disputing the throne. Hyrcanus II, supported by the Pharisees, and Aristobulus II, supported by the Sadducees. They couldn't resolve their differences. They made a fatal mistake. They appealed to Rome. General Pompey, who was in the region reorganizing newly conquered territories, marched to Jerusalem to arbitrate the dispute. Hyrcanus opened the gates, but supporters of Aristobulus fortified themselves on the Temple Mount, refusing to surrender. Pompey besieged them. 3 months of siege. The defenders didn't fight on the Sabbath, only defending themselves if directly attacked. Pompey took advantage. To advance siege works every Sabbath. When the walls were finally breached, 12,000 Jews died in the carnage that followed. Priests were massacred while continuing to offer sacrifices, refusing to abandon ritual duties even facing Roman swords. And Pompey did something no Gentile had done in centuries. He entered the Holy of Holies, that chamber where only the high priest could enter, and only once a year, on the Day of Atonement. Pompey pushed aside the sacred curtain. He looked inside. He found exactly what Gentile rumors didn't believe. Nothing. No image. No idol. Only empty space where God's presence was worshipped. Pompey left and touched nothing, but the desecration was done, and Hasmonean independence was finished. Israel became part of the Roman system. It would pay tributes. It would obey orders. It would have rulers approved by Rome. Hyrcanus II continued as high priest, but without real power. Antipater, a cunning Idumean, became the real power behind the throne, administering in Rome's name. And when the Roman civil wars came between Caesar and Pompey, then between Caesar's heirs and assassins, Antipater navigated skillfully, always supporting whoever seemed to be winning. Antipater's son was named Herod, and Herod would be king. In 37 before Christ, after years of political chaos, Herod finally consolidated total control over Judea with Roman military support. He was technically Jewish, since the Idumeans had been forcibly converted by the Hasmoneans 2 generations earlier, but no one considered him truly Israelite. He was seen as a foreigner, a servant of Rome, a usurper, and he was dangerous. Brilliant administrator, visionary builder, but also paranoid to the extreme and brutal without limits. Herod executed his favorite wife, Mariamne, a descendant of the Hasmoneans, accused of conspiracy. He executed his mother-in-law. He executed 3 of his own sons over the years, all suspected of plotting against him. Emperor Augustus supposedly commented that it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son, a play on words in Greek where the words are similar. And Herod indeed didn't eat pork, maintaining at least that appearance of Jewish observance. But Herod also built impressive fortresses like Masada atop a cliff in the desert, with palaces, storehouses and cisterns to withstand years of siege. Herodium, an artificial mountain that would be his mausoleum. Caesarea Maritima, a completely new port city with an artificial harbor built using Roman concrete that hardened underwater. A temple dedicated to Augustus, theater, hippodrome. Extraordinary engineering work on a coast that had no natural harbor. But Herod's supreme project was the reconstruction of the Jerusalem temple. Not simple renovation, total reconstruction and massive expansion. The temple platform was expanded to create one of the largest sacred spaces in the ancient world. Gigantic retaining walls were built, filled with thousands of tons of earth and stone. Some of the stones in these walls weigh 400, 500, even 600 tons. They were cut, transported, and positioned with precision that still impresses modern engineers. The sanctuary itself was rebuilt with magnificence, gold covering the facade, doors of Corinthian bronze, porticos with monolithic columns. The historian Josephus, who saw the temple before its destruction, wrote that its external appearance was everything that could astonish both mind and eyes. Whoever didn't see Herod's temple never saw a beautiful building, was a common saying. The main work took approximately 10 years, but finishing work continued for decades. The temple was only completely finished in 63 after Christ, 7 years before being totally destroyed by the Romans. While Herod built and executed, while Rome consolidated power over the eastern Mediterranean, another silent transformation was happening. The roads. Rome was absolutely obsessed with roads. Via Appia, Via Flaminia, Via Egnatia, and dozens of others. At the empire's peak, more than 400,000 kilometers of paved roads connected provinces. Originally built to move legions quickly to any point where rebellion might arise, they served equally for commerce, official mail, travelers of all kinds. Each road was a work of engineering, deep foundations draining water, layers of compacted stone, paved surface, frequently with basalt blocks, markers every 1,000 paces indicating distances, horse-changing stations for imperial mail, inns at regular intervals. traveler could leave Hispania in the far west and arrive in Syria in the far east, using roads maintained by the state. Not quickly, not comfortably, but predictably. For the first time in history, 3 continents were connected by standardized transportation infrastructure, and there was peace, Pax Romana. After centuries of civil wars, after decades of border conflicts, Augustus established a period of relative internal stability. The Mediterranean, which had been infested with pirates, became a patrolled and safe Roman lake. Trade routes flourished, cities prospered. Travel was safer than it had ever been. A messenger, a merchant, a preacher, anyone with a message to transmit could cross the empire with reasonable safety. Within Israel and scattered throughout the Mediterranean world, another institution had developed during those 400 years of prophetic silence, the synagogues. The exact origin is debated among historians, but they probably began during or after the Babylonian exile, when Jews far from the temple needed a place for study, prayer, and community. In the 1st century, synagogues existed in virtually every significant city of the Roman Empire. Alexandria had several, some enormous. Rome had at least 11. Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, Thessalonica, Philippi, wherever there was a Jewish community, there was a synagogue. Each synagogue was a center of instruction in the scriptures. Every Sabbath, scrolls were read, translated if necessary, explained. It was a community meeting point, a place of preserved identity amid foreign cultures. And it was a space where any adult Jewish man could stand up and read or teach if the local leaders permitted. A decentralized network of teaching and community centers spread throughout the known world. And along with the synagogues came curious Gentiles, called in ancient texts God-fearers or worshippers of God. People of pagan origin who rejected the polytheism of their ancestors, who felt attracted to Jewish monotheism, to the elevated ethics of the Torah, to the venerable antiquity of the traditions. They attended synagogues on Sabbaths. They observed some practices. They worshipped the God of Israel. But they didn't convert completely because full conversion for men required circumcision, and that was a significant physical and social barrier in the Greco-Roman world, where athletic nudity was common and circumcision was seen as barbaric mutilation. There existed then, scattered throughout the Roman world, a considerable population of sympathetic Gentiles, knowledgeable of Jewish scriptures through the Septuagint, believers in the one God of Israel, perhaps waiting for something that would allow them to fully belong without the cut in the flesh. Within Judaism itself, the 400 years produced significant theological diversification. The Pharisees emerged as a popular party, present in villages and cities, emphasizing meticulous interpretation of the law, oral tradition that explained and expanded the written Torah, belief in bodily resurrection of the dead, in angels and spirits, in divine providence that worked through human free will. The Sadducees, generally from the priestly and aristocratic elite, rejected oral tradition as human invention. They accepted only the 5 books of Moses as supreme authority. They didn't believe in resurrection, nor in angels, nor in fate, only in absolute free will and in the importance of keeping the temple functioning and political relations stable. The Essenes, possibly the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran, withdrew to communities in the desert. They considered the temple corrupted since non-Zadokite high priests had taken over. They lived in community of goods, practiced rigorous ritual purity, studied prophecies intensely. They awaited apocalyptic divine intervention, a final war between sons of light and sons of darkness. The Zealots channeled national frustration into active resistance against Rome. They saw paying taxes to Caesar as idolatry, recognition of human sovereignty where only God should reign. They were willing to kill and die for Israel's freedom. Each group interpreted the situation differently. Each group had its own vision of how restoration would come. but all agreed on fundamental points. The prophecies had not been completely fulfilled. The promised kingdom had not come. The descendant of David who would reign forever was not on the throne. The prophetic silence weighed on everyone. Generations grew up hearing that God had spoken to the fathers, that he had done wonders in Egypt, in the wilderness, in the conquest, in the days of the judges, of the kings, of the prophets, that he had promised final redemption, complete restoration, an era of peace and justice. And generations died without seeing visible fulfillment of those promises. Faithfulness was maintained by stubbornness, by conviction, by hope transmitted as precious inheritance from parents to children. God promised, God will act. Perhaps not in our generation, but he certainly will. 400 years like this. 400 years where prophets were remembered, not heard. 400 years where miracles were stories of the past, not present experience. 400 years of waiting, of tested faithfulness, of patience stretched to the limit. And then, in the final years of that period, sometime during Herod's reign, later records would indicate strange events. Magi from the east, following astronomical calculations, seeking a newborn king of the Jews. Shepherds in fields of Bethlehem reporting visions of heavenly armies announcing peace on earth. An old man named Simeon in the temple, declaring that his eyes had seen salvation prepared before all peoples. A prophetess named Anna, who never left the temple, recognizing something in a common baby that others didn't. See, rumors that most dismissed. Stories that seemed like fantasy from simple folk or overly hopeful elderly. No Persian, Greek, or Roman general woke up thinking he was fulfilling a greater purpose. No scribe in Alexandria imagined his translation would span millennia. No road builder calculated that those stones would carry a message that would change civilizations. No synagogue founder foresaw that he was creating a network ready to receive and transmit something that didn't yet exist. 400 years of history happened with billions of human decisions, wars, treaties, conquests, defeats, constructions, destructions. And when the period ended, the world was unrecognizable. A universal language everyone understood, roads connecting 3 continents, scriptures translated and accessible, Jewish communities established in every major city, sympathetic Gentiles waiting for a way to belong, an empire maintaining forced peace that allowed safe travel. The most elaborate stage in history was set, and the play that would be performed on it still echoes to this day.